So we'll now move on to the satin stitch part of the leaf over the top of the padding that you've prepared. Just one little tip before we do that. I've got a little bit of floss still here. If you do finish your padding and you feel that any aspect of your outline is a little bit bumpy, or it dips in, or sticks out a little bit, anything like that, it's perfectly fine to go back and add a little bit more split stitch, either just outside what you've done or on top of what you've already done, just to make it as smooth as possible. It can be quite easy by the time you've put all your padding internally within the shape to have disrupted the smoothness of the split stitch a little bit, so adding another bit afterwards can be helpful. That could just be in one place where you've got a little dent, or you may feel that it would be helpful for you to put a whole nother row of split stitch around the full perimeter of your shape. It can be helpful when you're working the satin to have this double row of split stitch, one row on top of the other, because then when your satin stitch sits over the top, it's easier to control the edge. It doesn't pull in as much, it doesn't squash, things like that. So if you find it helpful, it's not essential, but it's there if you are struggling. If you're struggling to maintain the edge, I would go in and put that second row in on top of the previous row. So we'll now move on to the satin using the linen. So this is the Irish linen thread. One point to make really clear before we do the satin is that linen thread will never ever produce the very beautifully smooth satin stitch that a cotton or silk thread would produce. It just isn't that kind of thread. It's stiffer, much stiffer to work with. It varies in thickness a little bit, so you get slubs in it, you get thin bits, thick bits, and so it just is never going to produce that absolutely beautifully glossy, smooth, ultra smooth edged satin stitch that you get with silk or cotton. It's a beautiful thread to use, however, it's got a gorgeous sheen to it, and it's got its own natural texture, which is quite different to anything else and really suits this project. And of course it was the thread used in the original bedspread from which the inspiration for this piece came. So when we come to the satin, we've cast on in the normal way with a waist knot and 2 little cast on stitches in an area that's going to be covered by following satin stitch. I'm going to lay my first stitch in, which is in a contrasting angle to the original satin stitch, so at 45 degrees to the shape, and lay that across. Make sure that's a nice long diagonal. Don't make your diagonal too flat or too steep. It's a pretty midway 45 degree diagonal. It's a good idea after that to take a little locking stitch into your padding. That just locks the position of that stitch and keeps it steady while you work the rest of the satin, and also means if you do have to unpick at all, that stitch will remain in place. We're then going to work towards the base of the leaf, and to do that we're going to come up at the top of the shape and go down at the bottom of the shape. By the way, just to clarify, I started not necessarily at the midpoint of the leaf with that first stitch, but at the fattest part of the shape. It's very difficult to set the angle correctly if you start at the tip or at the base, where the shape's much narrower and the angle can be tricky to begin with, can fall off the edge, and it can be very tricky to maintain all the way down the leaf. So that's why we start at approximately at the fattest point. So working towards the base of the leaf now, we're going to bring the needle up at the top and take it down at the bottom. Now there are important things that we did there that help you to maintain the angle. When the needle comes up on the top edge, we're going to bring the needle straight to the sky like a rocket. And even more importantly, we're leaving a little gap. It is a small gap, but it's a significant gap between the needle and the tip of the previous stitch. It's about the thickness of a number 10 needle here, but a clearer guide is that that gap should be about the width of the thread that you're using. So we come up and we've got our little gap. As we descend, it's quite different. The needle is angled down tucking tightly towards the previous satin stitch, like so. So we'll do that again and talk a little more about the descending angle. So the needle emerges on the top edge, a small gap, needle's width or the thickness of the thread you're using between the needle and the tip of the previous stitch. As the needle descends, it tucks towards the previous stitch, but a couple more important points here. The line of your needle is parallel to the split stitch at the point you're working. So you lay your needle down and it's lying parallel to that edge. You then raise your needle to about 45 degrees from the fabric, so about a 45-degree angle from the needle down to your ground fabric. Don't have it too upright, that's not good, and don't have it too shallow, really low to the fabric. It's about midway. You then tuck your needle into that little crevice that's formed between the split stitch and the previous satin stitch. There's a nice little crevice to snuggle the needle into, pushing tightly towards the previous stitch. So there's no gap at all on this side, on the descending side. It's tight